Hello everyone and welcome back to TowerGate. It is day 263, Sunday morning, November 26th, 2017. Thank you so much for tuning in. Okay, so kind of a slow news day today, so I thought I would take advantage of answering a couple questions and dealing with a couple things that people have mentioned in the comments section over the past couple weeks. The two issues I'm going to deal with today. First, there's a lot of people that, we've been talking about the FISA Court, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, and also we've had, I had a request a few weeks back. I can't remember if it was, I think it might have been Spy Girl or one of my other lovely lady subscribers who asked me to talk about the Clinton body count thing that everybody talks about a lot. So that's what I'm going to talk about today, the FISA Court and the Clinton body count. So the thing about the Clinton body count, and I don't know how many it's up to now. Some people say it's like 87. There's another one that has like 114. These are all people who have had some association with the Clintons over the years, who have died under suspicious circumstances. And there's a couple ways you can look at that. When you're a public person, a governor, certainly a president, you meet lots and lots and lots of people. So when you talk about the Clintons, they probably have a sphere of people around them that is probably 100 times what any of us would have, as far as people that we know, people we've met, people we've done business with, people we've associated with. So there is some truth to the fact that when you have this large of circle of people that you would have some contact with, particularly when you're dealing with government people and things like that, you're going to have a much wider scope of people who would die, and some of them dying of mysterious circumstances. So I think you can put some of that into that category. But when you look at some of these cases regarding the Clintons, you can only go so far with that first, idea that, well, they just know a lot of people. At some point, there are people who were very closely connected to the Clintons and things they were involved in, who did meet some fairly suspicious, very unique circumstances in their deaths. So you can't chalk it all up to just the fact that they know a lot of people. There's got to be other things involved. Now, when you look into some of these individual murders, and suspicious deaths, a lot of them claim to be suicides or whatever, you find that a lot of these people, yeah, they had connections to the Clintons, but mostly what they were connected to was they had information, they had knowledge, they knew things. And this will get you killed pretty quick when you're hanging around with people like the Clintons or the Bushes and you know too much. The intelligence community, they have I guess they feel like they have a right to protect the state secrets. It goes beyond just protecting the people in the Oval Office or whatever, or the governor's mansion or whatever. It goes beyond that. It gets into things like national security and just protecting the government itself. So, this thing gets, gets a lot of things going on. But when you look at a lot of these suspicious deaths that happened around the Clintons, it's as much, I think, not so much about the Clintons and the shady things that they were up to. Some of it could be that, and probably is, but a lot of it had to do with the activities that were going on around Mena, Arkansas. For those of you who don't know, the CIA was running massive amounts of weapons and cocaine through Mena Airport in Arkansas, and this is probably where the Bush-Clinton relationship began. Bush was involved in as a high-level CIA guy working out of the Caribbean, being over the Caribbean area, and having to do a lot with a lot of the weapons and cocaine that was being moved between the states and South America. I think that they probably were looking for a corrupt governor who they could run operations in his state, a state that was kind of low profile, maybe a small town with an airport. They could expand the runway to accommodate military cargo planes and things like that. So I think that's what happened in Mena, Arkansas, is that they thought, yeah, this would be a good place, and hey, there's a governor there that's known to be horribly corrupt, and he can easily be brought into this. We just have to make sure that we take care of him and the people around him. They love money, they love cocaine, in that type of thing, and I think we can get something done there. So I think that's how that whole relationship began, and there's no question that Mena, Arkansas has come up in many investigations around sending weapons. We were funding the Contras with weapons. Those were all being flown out of Mena. There was massive amounts of cocaine. These planes would bring cocaine in and take guns out. And people who worked at the Mena, Arkansas airport would say, yeah, I mean, it was just all night long, one cargo plane after another, just unloading tons and tons of cocaine, loading up weapons, money, huge stacks of shrink-wrapped money being loaded off planes. So yeah, there was a lot of money, a lot of drugs, and all these types of things. And people who have known the Clintons for a long time and knew them back in their days in Arkansas talk about the fact that Bill Clinton, along with some of his friends, were heavy cocaine users, and they also used to procure women by using the cocaine. They could lure young girls in by offering them cocaine, getting them hooked on it, and then they could use that to get these girls, give them the cocaine they wanted in exchange for sexual favors. So they'd have these parties where there'll be lots of cocaine and young girls around, and Bill Clinton was right in the center of it. And according to Dolly Kyle and some other people who knew Clinton back in the Arkansas days, he himself was a very large user of cocaine. We don't know about Hillary, what her habits were, but we know that Bill Clinton is alleged to have been a big cocaine user back in the 80s and was had a little bit of a corrupt operation going himself where they were making lots of money hand over fist, and there was a lot of people who had to cover, for the Clintons and hide that money. And this is where Vince Foster comes into play. Now, because there are so many people, as I explained in the comments section, when this commenter asked me to talk about the Clinton body count thing, there are so many that it would take me hours and hours and hours to go through all of these murders and unexplained deaths and things like that. So what I thought I would do is kind of pick out a few here and there that I'll talk about on these kind of slower news days, and specifically look at some of the more interesting cases and the ones that probably, in my mind, the most suspicious. And I think when you're looking at that, I think the probably number one most suspicious and most publicized one, the one most people know about, is of course the death of Vince Foster. Now Vince Foster, of course, knew, because he grew up with the Clintons. He went to school with the Clintons. He was Hillary's best friend all through school. Knew Bill very well in Arkansas. When Bill went to the governorship of Arkansas, Vince Foster was invited to work at the law firm with Hillary Clinton, and they eventually became partners in that law firm. Then when they went to Washington, Vince Foster came along with them. He had to, because Vince Foster was critical person in hiding a lot of the illegal and nefarious activities of the Clintons, both their financial dealings and other types of dealings. Now, Clinton had other people who generally took care of the illegal stuff that was dealing with the drugs and the CIA and all that kind of stuff. And Vince Foster basically took care of the stuff that was more above board but shady, like the land deals and all that kind of thing. So Vince Foster was known to be a fairly honest guy. He loved the Clintons, idolized them, but at some point the pressure that he found himself under when he came to Washington, D.C., having to cover up for the Clintons' crimes, just eventually, a lot of people think, got to him and may have led him to commit suicide. Other people believe that he was getting ready to be questioned in the TowerGate fiasco, and he knew he would either have to perjure himself and lie, which he didn't want to do, or give up the Clintons, specifically Hillary in this case. And a lot of people think that they took him out because they thought, Vince might break down. He might not be able to handle it, the pressure, and he might break down and give up some information, and we can't take that risk, so he's got to go. So either way, however you want to look at it, but there's awfully suspicious circumstances surrounding the death of Vince Foster, and I remember that time very, very well. Remember it very well. It was suspicious from day one, and it remained suspicious for several years. In fact, every time they tried to have a cover-up investigation to make it all go away, it didn't work. people didn't believe it. So they ended up having 5 different investigations on the Vince Foster matter. And still, after 5 investigations, no one really believed any of the findings, which would all agree with each other that it was a suicide. There was just too many things that didn't add up about this particular crime, and you had a lot of people who were not known for being in the conspiracy theorist side of things coming out and making their doubts public. And the most famous of those was a radio broadcaster, a legendary radio broadcaster named Paul Harvey. Paul Harvey was a legend and a giant in the broadcasting business, and not known as someone who was would get sucked into conspiracy theories or even talked about them. But he really is the one who broke it wide open when he came out and did his normal noon radio broadcast called The Rest of the Story, and he talked on this issue of the Vince Foster murder and talked about all the suspicious things that didn't add up. That was a major thing. You also had, at the time, a famous radio talk show host that was involved in Watergate, G. Gordon Liddy, who had a popular talk show, and he had Chris Ruddy. And Chris Ruddy was a journalist who was probably the one who jumped all over this and wrote about it, followed this story, and eventually wrote a book detailing all the problems with the official story. And I remember he would be on G. Gordon Liddy almost every week with an update about all the things that were suspicious. Many other talk shows were picking up on this as well. So it's a conspiracy theory that really became mainstreamed. And even average people who generally don't follow these types of things became interested and curious and doubting the official story. So let's go through some of the problems with the Vince Foster murder. Okay, so he was found dead. Vince Foster was found dead on July the 20th, 1993 at around 6:30. He was found in Fort Marcy Park, which is in Washington, D.C. He was 48 years old. The alleged weapon was a .38 caliber revolver dating back from 1913. Bill, Hillary, and Vince Foster, of course, as I mentioned, were childhood friends. Foster and Hillary worked at the same law firm. They eventually became partners. And, of course, Foster came to Washington with the Clintons when Bill Clinton was elected president. There was also a lot of rumors at the time that Hillary may have been involved romantically with Vince Foster. He personally denied that accusation. In preparation to get to the White House, Foster worked like a dog to expunge Bill and Hillary's financial records in relation to a shady land deal known as Whitewater, and then later another deal which got Hillary into trouble with the deal that was about some land called the Castle Grande. These were like properties that they sold to old people, brought a high-pressure salesman in to give them a high-pressure sales pitch. They would get these people on paper, get them to buy these sort of like resort properties, and then if they became even 2, 3, 4, 5 days late on a payment, they confiscated the property and filed legal papers to take the property, and they sucked an awful lot of senior citizens out of their life savings in doing so. And this was a Hillary operation primarily, working with some of her corrupt banker and real estate friends. Vince Foster, of course, had to cover all the stuff up. When they left Arkansas, there was a lot of loose ends that had to be tied up, and Hillary pressured Vince Foster greatly, and he was working literally 24 hours a day for weeks before they went to Washington, trying to hide and cover up and clean up the crimes of the Clintons in Arkansas, which he didn't want to follow them to Washington. Hillary ordered, of course, the firing of 7 staff members at the travel office once they got into Washington. It's one of the first things she did, and that led to the TowerGate issue. And of course, Vince had to clean that up as well. And that's probably the one I think that, if you believe in the suicide theory, that's probably the thing that the pressure got to him at that point. Or if you believe the murder theory, it's the fact that he was going to have to testify in front of a committee, and if he revealed the truth, Hillary would be going to Sing Sing, and if he didn't reveal the truth, he would have to lie under oath, and he was afraid that he might be caught lying under oath because he really didn't know what the other side knew. So it may have been the pressure that got to him there. Foster told his wife that he was tired of the pressure and that he was ready to go back to Arkansas during that time. Shortly after Foster's death, Hillary's aides raided Vince Foster's office, removed files illegally, denied it at first, but were later forced to admit it about 2 years later when they were subpoenaed for those documents. Of course, there was problems with the official story from day one. Now, on the morning of Foster's death, when he walked out of the office that day at about lunchtime, he told his secretary that he would be back after lunch, and of course he stepped out of the office and he never returned. Foster's wound was a single gunshot wound from a .38 into his mouth, yet there was hardly any blood at the crime scene, nor any blood on the gun. Now, normally when a person commits suicide with a handgun, particularly in the head or something like that, you have what's called blowback. You have blood and brain matter and bone and tissue that get blown back onto the weapon itself. But there was not a shred of blood or anything like that on the handgun. In fact, his thumb, if you look at the picture, they show the picture where the gun is still attached to his thumb. His body is laid out on this hillside where he was at a pitched angle with his head upward and his feet downward. His body laid almost completely straight out like he was being prepared to be put into a coffin. And the gun and his right arm were down at his side, and the barrel of the gun was actually underneath his leg a little bit, still attached to his hand with his thumb around it, and you could see his thumb around the gun, and his arm was extended downward about almost to his knee. So this was a very for detectives who look at a lot of murders and a lot of suicides and things like that, this was very suspicious, because it's one of them things that they never really see. Generally, when you kill yourself with a gun, the gun flies out of your hand as a natural response. You always have reflex. You have gun and you have blood and things like that all over the gun. It looked to a lot of detectives who looked at the crime scene photo like it was not a suicide. It looked more like a setup murder. The body, of course, was laid out perfectly straight with the gun, of course, attached to his thumb, like I just explained. There was no bullet found. They used metal detectors and brought in people, and they were going all over the place looking for the bullet or the brass. They could not ever find it, but they found lots and lots of. They even found brass and bullets from the Civil War era, because this was a Civil War park, Marcy Park. It's a park that was kind of a dedication to Civil War battles that were fought there in the area. So they were finding all kinds of metal objects, including objects dating back over 100 years. But they were not able to find the brass or the round that would have been responsible for Vince Foster's death. There were no powder burns on Foster's hands. His teeth were not damaged. A lot of times if you put a gun in your mouth and you pull the trigger, the recoil will cause chipping on the teeth. There was no damage to the teeth from the recoil on the .38, and a .38 has a pretty good recoil to it. There was no trace of soil or grass on Vince Foster's shoes, despite the fact that he had to walk approximately 700 feet to get to the park, the place in the park where his body was found. And this park had basically dirt trails. So it wasn't like they were paved trails all through the park. They were dirt trails mostly. And he had to walk through these dirt trails, through brush and grass and forest, yet his shoes were as clean as they could possibly be. Nothing on the bottom of his shoes, nothing to indicate he had walked through a forest. No one saw Foster alive in the park. There was people in the park, but no one saw him walking around, entering or exiting the park. No one heard a gunshot, despite the fact there was plenty of people around. No one heard a gunshot. There were no fingerprints on the gun. The gun was actually made from two different guns, parts from an old gun from 1913 and some newer parts from a newer gun. And of course that sometimes is evidence of a professional hit, and they call those types of guns drop guns, guns that you don't mind if they're found because they can't be traced. The gun was made, like I said, from two guns, but Foster was covered from head to toe with carpet fibers, and this is something that was a big deal at the time, how to explain where all them carpet fibers came from. It almost suggested he'd been wrapped in a carpet or a rug or something like that, and killed one place and moved to another place, which was the prevailing theory at that time, and probably still is. Foster, of course, had blood traces on his face that suggested his head was moved, in 4 different positions after he was shot from the trail of the blood. So another indication the body was killed one place and moved to another. There was blood trails that were going upward, which of course defies the laws of gravity, because the angle that Foster was laying on, the blood trails should have been going down, but you can see they're all going up. There's 4 blood trails, and they were all going up, which of course was a suspicious again to the investigators. There was a witness who saw a brown car with Arkansas plates. It was a rust brown Honda. When this gentleman looked at that car, the guy rolled down the window, gave him a very dirty look like, hey buddy, you need to be nowhere near here or whatever. Kind of scared him away. This witness was not interviewed for 9 months until he was finally contacted to be interviewed by like the 2nd or 3rd investigation committee, and at which point his testimony was changed, and he was also threatened and followed by men wearing very nice suits who were trying to affect his testimony. Then they came up with a suicide note. After Foster was killed, they went through his briefcase 2 times and didn't say anything about finding anything. But the 3rd time, after a couple of days, they came up saying that there was a suicide note, which was torn into 28 pieces. But it was not really a suicide note because it didn't do any of the things a suicide note usually does. It didn't tell why he did it, didn't say goodbye to his wife and kids, really didn't just do anything that a suicide note would generally do. And all it had was like a sentence in it that said something like, no one will believe in the innocence of the Clintons. And he talked about how he was under, a lot of pressure and things like that. But really not your typical suicide note. Also, there was no fingerprints whatsoever on the suicide note, despite the fact it was torn into 28 pieces. We had an Arkansas state trooper who received a call from Chelsea's nanny, and that phone call, this detective said, came in somewhere between 6:30 and 7:30 Arkansas time, despite the fact that Hillary says she didn't learn about it until 8:30, 8:30, and Bill Clinton didn't learn about it until 10 o'clock p.m. because he had been on Larry King that night. He says he found out when he got off the air from the Larry King show. So the FBI then pressured this this Arkansas state trooper to change his story about the timeline, which he never would. And also the fact they tried to get him to say, well, maybe you're confused, but the fact is when he took the phone call, he had a tablet of paper and a pen in front of him, and he wrote down the contents of the phone call and also the time. There are death photos which show a black gun, but the FBI showed the wife a silver gun, and she confirmed that it was his gun. He did own a silver gun, and that's what she was shown. But the EMTs, who were the first people to arrive on the scene, said it was a black gun, and the photo shows a black gun. The alarm codes show that a MiG group entered Foster's office that evening somewhere around 9:15. The MiG group is a group of the Secret Service. They are maintenance and installation group. They do technical support, stuff like that. They plant cameras, look at cameras, they're kind of in the surveillance guys for the Secret Service. They can pick locks, pick doors, set up cameras, set up bugs, wires, things like that. And they entered his office at about 9:15. Then we had the crazy story about Mr. X. Mr. X was a man who contacted a popular journalist at the time named Paul Rodriguez, who had been writing about the story for Inside Magazine. This man would never go public. He was fearing for his life, but he says he was in Fort Marcy Park and saw 2 well-dressed men in suits carrying a man that appeared to be drunk through the park, and he seemed to meet Vince Foster's description. This man would never come forward because he was very frightened. But the reason that Paul Rodriguez and many other people give him credibility is because he gave details of the crime and the crime scene that were not known to the public at that time. They were only known to the investigators who were first on scene at the crime scene. So this guy's giving out details to Paul Rodriguez that he shouldn't know, which gave him credibility, and that's the explanation for the Mr. X thing. After 8 or 9 contacts with Mr. Rodriguez, he eventually went away. We never heard from him again. So these are just some of the questions a lot of people had and inconsistencies a lot of people had about the death of Vince Foster, the murder, the suicide, whatever you want to think. Now, there are people who have known the Clintons for a very long time who will say that, well, Bill Clinton was really just a good time rock and roller. He liked going out and picking up chicks, snorting cocaine, hanging out with his buds. Just a good time rock and roller, that type of guy. And that Hillary was really the one who would order these types of things. She was the serious one that took care of the dirty work. And so that's what a lot of people believe, that probably Bill Clinton a lot of times didn't like to be associated with, or didn't want to be a part of having to take people out, kill people, whatever, but that Hillary was Johnny on the spot, and that she never had any problem with taking someone out who might be a problem or a threat to the Clintons and their power. That she's really the Black Widow of the story, and that Bill Clinton's just a good time rock and roller, trying to get through life and take all he can and get all he can, while Hillary was really the enforcer. Larry Nichols and Dick Morris both go way back with the Clintons, back to their Arkansas days, and both of them have stated that Hillary was definitely the one, not so much Bill. He was along for the ride, good time rock and roller. Hillary was the one that was really the one that was had the whatever it takes to take people down or get rid of people, however you want to look at it. So this is one of the many strange and suspicious deaths of people around the Clintons, and this is probably the most high-profile one, the Vince Foster murder. And so, yeah, this is just one of many. We'll continue on Slow News Days to go through some more. There's about a half a dozen that are really outstanding to me, and these are the ones that I'm probably going to focus on with the Clinton body count. Like I say, probably not 80 or 100 or whatever. All these are directly connected to the Clintons. Some of these may or may not be, but at the same time, you can't completely remove the possibility that some of these are legitimately things that the Clintons ordered done or Hillary ordered done. A lot of them, like I say, when you dig into them, they look to me more like CIA took care of the business. And, of course, there was involvement with the Clintons, but a lot of these murders and deaths were had to do with people who knew things about the operations in MENA, the drugs and weapons smuggling and things like that going on in MENA. But there are other suspicious things that have to do with Clinton's philandering, land deals, unscrupulous things that the Clintons were involved in Arkansas. So we'll continue to move and look at those things as we move along. And I think next we'll take a look at the mysterious death of Ron Brown. Another very interesting death around the Clintons. So that's the first of the Clinton body count stories that we've got. Vince Foster, what do you all think? I think it was. I think he was killed someplace else, brought to Fort Marcy Park. I think it's because they feared that he would say something that he would break down, that he wouldn't be able to take the pressure. And I don't know if it was directly ordered by the Rotten Reverend. It may have been carried out or ordered by someone else within the deep state, the Secret Service, maybe the CIA, who all had an interest, of course, in making sure that Vince Foster didn't say anything either, because they were protecting a covert operation. The Clintons wanted protection from him saying something that would implicate Hillary in TowerGate, but the CIA or whoever, the DEA, whoever, they would have been interested in protecting the covert operations that had been going on in MENA. So take your pick. The official story, I don't believe. Whether or not it was the Clintons or the intelligence agencies that took him out, or the DEA, I don't know. But I believe he was killed someplace else and moved to Fort Marcy Park. What do you all think? Now, the FISA Court. It's very simple. The FISA Court is the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court. They were set up in 1978 after the Church Committee hearings. For those of you who don't know, there was a thing called the Church Committee hearings in the late 70s, where the CIA was brought in and forced to testify and admit to a lot of things they didn't want to admit to. And as a result, there was a public outcry to rein in the CIA and the intelligence agencies. And so in doing so, they created a bunch of a bunch more layers of bureaucracy to give the illusion that there was more oversight on the intelligence agencies, but they were really, like the FISA court, just rubber stamps. The FISA court approves 99.7% of FISA requests for surveillance on citizens, both American and foreign nationals. Of course, it's a secret court. There's hearings are closed. They're not open to the public. The court judges on the surveillance court, on the FISA court, are appointed by the Supreme Court Justice, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, which now would be John Roberts. There are 11 judges total who sit on the FISA court at any one time. They serve 7-year terms. They are staggered every 2 years. So every 2 years, the president makes another appointment, the Chief Justice makes another appointment of another FISA court judge, and one goes away. So you keep 11 at all times. They serve 7-year terms, staggered every 2 years for their appointments. Currently, of the 11 judges that are sitting on the FISA court, 8 of them were Obama appointees or appointed while Obama was president. If Trump serves 2 terms, at the end of his second term, you would have probably 7, 8, 9 of the FISA court judges would have been approved during his presidency. But of course, John Roberts will probably still be the Chief Justice because he's fairly young. So unless he has some health issues or something, it's likely that he'll still continue to appoint, in which case John Roberts would have appointed all of the judges sitting on the FISA court. The FISA court goes through the same process a similar court would go through, where they look at an application for a warrant and they approve it or disapprove it. Like I said, 99.7% of the time they do approve the warrant. So anyway, hopefully that answers some of the questions about the FISA court. They're a secret court. The Chief Justice does the appointments, and they're generally judges that come from, they're federal judges, and they can come from the appellate court or whatever court, as long as they're federal judges. Should also be noted that the judges serving now were appointed to the federal court by either Obama or Clinton, and probably some by Bush as well. So anyway, that's pretty much what's going on with the FISA court and secret court. It's a rubber stamp. It's just, it's what they do. Thank you so much for tuning in. I'll be back tomorrow with Monday's TowerGate. See ya.